Enemy of the Sun, this is the poem to my brother Fatih by Rashid Hussein. For your sake, Fatih, I broke the lock on my lips. For you, I slaughtered silence in my heart. To write these lines, to build a wall in the face of death. For you, Fatih, believe me, I cast the letters to make a sentence. Fatih, the sun that bathes the wounds of the fig trees, its rays are dyed in blood by the executioners. The same sun that toasts the wheat in the gold in the fields of China. It wrings tears from the foreheads of peasants in our village. You may not understand, Fatih, but tomorrow you shall grow up, and the field will grow a green root before your eyes. In the lungs of the brown planter's son will be crucified. Who knows? You may accept or reject the present reality. If you reject, you shall grow up. If you acquiesce, you become smaller. Fatih, you may not understand why the East is tired of silence, or why the dead vomited and gave death a bridge, or why your feet cried, or why I wrote this, but tomorrow you shall grow and understand. For your sake, for the children, believe me.
Hey everyone, welcome to the second episode of The Dugout. This is going to be a great episode because it's going to be a masterful follow-up to our first, which was about Black anarchism, propaganda, and whether or not Black representations of revolution in cinema can be a kind of legitimate vehicle for radical ideology. But in today's episode, we'll be doing a deep dive into the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians since October 7th, 2023, and of course before, what this ensuing violence after the October 7th attack on Israel by Hamas says about colonialism and the boundaries of mainstream political understandings of settler colonialism, Zionism, ethnic cleansing, and solidarity. This episode will reference a lot of readings and literature because we wanted to do our research, and that research is going to also be in our show notes and on our Substack. So, of course, those will be spaces that you can learn a lot more. Leave your comments on our show about what this episode kind of enlivens in you, and do your local work to fuck shit up, because what's happening is sometimes I don't even know the word to describe it, but it's unbelievable yet totally believable in the most fucked up way possible. So without further ado, welcome to episode 2 of The Dugout.
This episode, we're really going to be focusing on Black and Palestinian liberation, organizing, where the solidarity has been, where we have a history of connection and building upon each other's struggle, how we can continue to do that, and how we've been doing that since the October 7th attacks and since the backlash from the Israeli state and the IOF forces, which has been slaughtering a lot of the population. This episode is mainly talking a lot about decolonial thought and theory and actions and material implications, and where we have shown each other ways that have bolstered our movements in a way that have brought us closer to our goals, and in building a movement that can really defend ourselves against these attacks and make ourselves available to attack these systems that are oppressing and still have the strength to sustain ourselves while we do it.
I guess a question I have to intervene on that intro is, what do you say to people that accuse the left of being way too reactive in moments of political crisis, like what's happening right now?
I mean, everyone's reactive. I don't think we can afford to not be reactive. I also don't think we can afford to only be reactive. And that's a mindset, I think, something that we need to get through as a society. And that's just something we need to learn about, like, what are our incentives that help us get through things? The first thing that comes to mind is, like, that's a trauma response to, like, stay in a reactive mode. And that makes sense, because we're dealing with folks that are at the margins, but the highest points of violence when it comes to being on the margins, either being used as scapegoats for capital building for a certain group, or being completely disregarded and dehumanized consistently for generations. And that can coincide at the same time. So it just builds layers of things to react to. So much of it just human history of, in that reaction, there's already a life that was happening before we were reacting. And to remember that, hold that, and not censor it, but have it to be something to grow with, as well as whatever we're reacting to, can inform something that is autonomous, that is not only reactive, that is saying something beyond, no, but I'm anti this, I'm anti that. What about you?
I kind of agree when people say that about the left. I don't know. And I guess I think of reactive as an antonym to proactive, which to me, a proactive left would be in the dominant position. And maybe I just feel like we're leaned over on our little booty hole and we're trying to fight the system off. I don't know a better way to say it, but we're fighting back as best we can. It's looking like a fucked up kind of thing. I also don't think that means we're losing, but I do think it means, like, to me, being reactive means we're not in control. And I don't think we're in control.
Of course we're not. Do we have the capital to be in control? Do we have the capital to make the arms to be in control?
Maybe.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's something about guerrilla tactics, but there's also something about, like you said, those guerrilla tactics need to be tied to an autonomous community that is actually serving itself. What ways can we materially disengage from a capitalist society? Like hosting mutual aid societies, having free stores. I mean, we all take time to go shop, but how much do we go take time to pool money together, buy shit wholesale, and hold free stores that we all bought into? Like, how often do we do shit like that as a neighborhood, as a society, as a friend group, as a federation of friend groups, of DIY scenes, of anything? These are ways that, like, we can disengage from a profit motive, which is like what distinguishes how we use our money as capitalists, as being defined by how the capital is moving and to grow it only, instead of sustaining the land and the labor.
I have thought about, even just in the past few days, I'm like, why don't me and two of my friends go to the food pantry all in the same day? And then we all put the food together and then we meal prep / have a communal dinner. You can just make shit you just got that day from the food bank.
Going to the food bank with the gang. Even if you don't need, quote unquote, need the food bank, you going there supports the food bank and when they need to get their money, because they're a fucking nonprofit and they need to get their user signs to be like, this is how many people we serve. So even if you're just in the neighborhood, you're helping out everybody else in the neighborhood to sustain that program.
Last thoughts for the intro for this episode. I think we both kind of thought this episode was really important because obviously what's happening in Palestine is important, but it's connected to all other sorts of genocides and economic and environmental atrocities happening all around the world, whether it be Congo or Sudan. So many things happening all over. I think this larger conflict, ongoing ethnic genocide, connects to all those other things. Solidarity is extremely important when we're looking at any kind of global issue that we can argue or pontificate about, but also find actionable ways to organize our community on as well. What is happening in Palestine right now? Before we dive into this discussion, it's kind of important to do a recap on what's been happening over the past number of weeks, notably since October 7, 2023, when the Palestinian militant group Hamas launched an attack on occupied Palestinian territory. October 7th, Palestinian group Hamas launched Operation Al-Aqsa Flood inside Israel, killing dozens and taking hostages in a shocking assault, says one Al Jazeera piece. And on October 7th, this attack basically happened on the Jewish holiday of Simchat Torah on Shabbat, and one day after the 50th anniversary of the start of the Yom Kippur War. Hamas announced the start of what it called Operation Al-Aqsa Flood, stating it had fired over 5,000 rockets from Gaza Strip into Israel within a span of 20 minutes. At least 5 were killed by the rockets, allege numerous reports. Hamas also employed tactics such as aerial drones to assault Israeli observation posts, paragliders for infiltration into Israel, and motorcycles, which was unusual, according to many, by Hamas. Palestinian militants opened fire on Israeli boats. In the evening, they launched another barrage of 130 rockets towards Israel, and it was said that they went into a music festival and took numerous hostages. And since then, the response and assault upon the Gaza Strip and Palestinians by the State of Israel, the Israeli Defense Force, has been unprecedented. To date, the death toll is said to be 18,000 Palestinians have been killed and 49,500 injured in Israeli attacks on Gaza since October 7th, says Reuters, but other sources name upwards of 20 plus thousand Palestinians have been killed since October 7th. I know you were reading a couple other things as well.
There's a newer Reuters article and an NBC News article that claim that as it's nearing 200,000, so it's around 19,500 right now, with tens of thousands injured. One thing to note about the attack is that it seems like, especially with the recent pressures internationally for a ceasefire to get humanitarian aid and have hostage deals, it seems like the Hamas-led coalition's goal is to get hostages so that they can negotiate them for God knows how many of the 8,000 Palestinians that are already under administrative detention in occupied Palestinian territory. Israel has this administration detention policy. They can just arrest and detain people with no charges and no judicial process for up to 6 months, and it can be renewed indefinitely. And this is what a lot of the people that a couple of weeks ago we saw come home from the intermittent ceasefire, which was coincidentally right around one of the Western world's biggest consumer spending holidays, released some folks, and most of them were under administrative detention, some for a couple months, some for years. Some of them were children that are adults now that were coming back to their family for no other reason than being on the street, maybe throwing a rock, for doing nothing but existing under occupation. And that is the condition in which Palestinians, as a colonized entity, are facing and are fighting against. And it's important for us to highlight all the moments and reasons why people are fighting, especially when we have calls for ceasefires, calls for humanitarian aid. And it's important that we need, at any time, for an international community, when there's any conflict, to get aid to those that are suffering, especially those who have not little to do with the conflict, but little to do with the active involvement of certain segments that are irritating aggressors. But at the same time, I don't think anyone's telling Palestinians to stop fighting for their liberation. A lot of people are, but like the people who are calling for a ceasefire, like they want that, but it's also understood that that's important to get humanitarian aid in. And it is the starting point. Like you call for a ceasefire, you get a 3-day aid during Black Friday, and then it gets extended.
I think what you're saying is why I think it's important to have this conversation, because I think, one, we're talking about it from the side of we demand a ceasefire and I believe in Palestinian autonomy. There's so many points to the conversation, and one of them is also, are Palestinians separate from Hamas? Why or why not? And so when we talk about ceasefire, I just think it's important to acknowledge, like, there are some people that literally don't differentiate Hamas from Palestinians. And so to say that people that want a ceasefire support Palestinians fighting for their liberation, it's like, for some people, Hamas and Palestinians are synonymous.
It's something to do with the media, because as I'm looking at this NBC article, this is a Israel-Hamas war. There is, of course, there were a lot of Hamas troops there and a lot of them taking the lead in this coalition, but this is a coalition of resistance fighters that have happened. Multiple people were like, how could Hamas have done this? They blew everyone's world. So many conspiracy theories like Israel knew, they let it happen. How could they have let this happen? They blah, blah, blah. No, they have partners, and there's a reason for multiple people to be resisting against Israeli occupation of Palestinian descent and that are there, and people who are just like in there fighting, because there's lots of North Africans and West Africans that have gone to Palestine. Some of them have joined Hamas, and some of them have just joined the coalition and under different group. Multiple different reasons for why they're taking up arms, and that's kind of the basis point. But you can't talk about it like it's another PLO. Yeah. And it doesn't need to be another PLO. It needs to be whatever the people on the ground who are taking up arms, not even those who are taking up arms, but who are living on the land and off the land, are deciding for themselves. Not saying that to say I side with Hamas specifically. People who are taking up arms against oppressive forces with the support of on-the-ground folks, leaving the possibility for other people in coalitions to exist. I don't know the on-the-ground conditions of exactly how things operate, but there are certain things that I can align with in tactics and strategies to get the Israeli economy and reason for them to occupy and be so safe there, not necessarily a thing. Because if the Zionist project in itself cannot guarantee them safety, people will look for other resources. And the other resource doesn't have to be Hamas. It doesn't have to be this Hamas-led coalition. Yeah. It just has to be shown to people. And it needs to be clarified that what is happening, this moral and ethical dilemma, needs to be a dilemma of capital as well. In war, that's also human lives, human resources. And that is, some sides don't care about collateral as much. And we can see in this case, Gaza is not even that much bigger than Franklin County. Like, just lengthwise, like space-wise, I don't know the comparison. But by the time this episode is out, there will be over 20,000 dead. Through the recording of this, we've had to continue updating that count.
Yeah. And to that point, just to raise some other kind of headlines from over the past few weeks, Gazans have been told to go to the south by the Israeli president. And in recent days, if not the last week or so, the south, with roughly 1 million people, has been carpet bombed repeatedly. An NPR piece says Israeli bombardment has killed thousands of civilians in the area of Gaza Strip. Israel has ordered them to move to. Gaza Health Ministry death toll shows witness accounts. Satellite data and expert assessment gathered by NPR show that Israeli strikes and artillery fire occur daily in the areas Israel had said are the safer for civilians. They have hit schools, residential towers, and overcrowded UN refugee shelters. Amid its military offensive on Gaza City and the northern Gaza Strip, the Israeli military has repeatedly dropped leaflets and sent messages telling residents they must leave their homes and evacuate to areas it claims are safe. Also, churches, hospitals, shelters have been bombed, and other areas.
Also, the routes in which they told people to take have been bombed. And now, recently, the U.S. has told them that was their campaign in the north, and now they're going through the south of Gaza with their ground involvement, which the U.S. also wants them to take a little bit more of a step back on. But they're demanding that they give people grids again, just like they did in the north, to tell them which areas are safe areas to go to. Like, oh, we won't bomb this area, because right now they're not doing that. This has been a moment in public consciousness where we have seen people talk about Palestine in explicitly settler colonial understanding in a way that has mainly been trapped in activist circles and academic circles for multitude of different reasons. People are making the connections now, and honestly, it's because of indigenous activism and solidarity work and organizing that's been done in the Black decolonial struggle that has been active in this country for years. And that's an explicit call out from Palestinian organizers who are saying that, this is the groundwork in which we're working with, and this is an international framework. What we want to do in this episode explicitly is talk about how we have come together before as an international anti-colonial movement. As a lineage, we have informed each other. And before we kind of get into a lot of the specifics, we kind of want to break down what is colonialism, what is decolonialism, what is anti-colonialism, why is there so many fucking different words, and do they matter?
They do matter. All the words matter. I'm kind of interested in unpacking each of our definitions of colonialism and or what are some examples of colonialism that are kind of very clear to us that we've maybe looked into or studied that can kind of be conversation entry points. And I kind of enter it as my family is Jamaican. I grew up visiting Jamaica. Jamaica at certain points throughout its history was colonized by the Spanish and notably the British. That meant this brought slavery to the island. That meant this brought white supremacy, Christianity, all sorts of economic kind of segregation and devastation. And this notion that even if slaves are trying to free themselves, which is already like a existential struggle, you also have to navigate and fight towards political autonomy. And how do you have political autonomy when there is a colonizing force that is controlling the language that you speak, what kind of education systems you have, how much taxes are, whether or not you can walk on certain roads or be in certain areas. So all of these things that restrict different aspects of your human rights. And to survive that, to seek independence, which Jamaica did in 1964, I believe, or maybe 1962. And since then, Jamaica has struggled to establish itself economically, to go against political corruption internally, to figure out how to take loans and air quotes aid from other countries or first world powers, which usually just means you're entrapped in some kind of political and economic tango for a long time. What I see with what Israel has done is claiming it has religious precedent to go into a particular land and to relocate the people there, to torture and violate them, and to unjustly arrest them and detain them. It's just it's so many things. It's like literally the colonial handbook. And I see this throughout what has happened in Africa, what has happened in Central and South America, and also to like Jordan's point about what people experience internally when you come into the world through generations of colonization and through numerous forms of colonization. What does it mean to have a culture or a media or a political system that automatically teaches you these kind of colonial strategies just in school or even in your home or in your neighborhood? That's what colonialism is.
One thing that gets in my head when I think about colonialism is it's just another form of tyranny and of domination. Because like you don't hear about the good colonist. Like, oh man, they're so good for the people they're oppressing. Like, there's even myths about that, about the good slave owner, the good king. You don't really hear about the good colonist ever. But that's besides the point. The main central point of the tyranny is that it is an occupation, a foreign entity, and not foreign as in, I don't know, I'm trying not to be like, oh, the bad foreign thing, but foreign as in not having a context of the land, of the ecosystem, of how things are interacting in a bioregion, coming in, trying to systematically inform themselves about how the ecosystem works and a way to capitalize from it. That is what is inherent in colonialism and in the tyranny of colonialism, is that it is a capitalist tool to engage in bolstering an enterprise of a company, of a nation, of a set of companies, of a set of families, of a set of political and social ecosystems that are already in a dominatory hierarchy in another place that is not even engaging in the colonized entity's ecosystem. And that's where we get into the differences and the different complexities and moral complexities and psychological complexities that come in with settler colonialism. When folks actually decide to physically dominate the ecosystem in a way beyond just bombarding it until they feel like they have control in a way that they can manipulate them, but to make their own home, an idea, and create a new vision of places, completely disregarding an indigenous entity. I mean, there's so much cool revolutionary shit that happens in anti-colonial struggles, but it doesn't mean that's the same playbook to go through, because as colonialism grows, so will the anti-colonial struggle, and so will a decolonial struggle. For instance, something I kind of want to ask you about, like, what do you think is the difference? Like, why does that distinction matter?
I mean, sometimes I don't really know if I think it's that important of a difference. In more Western or like political spaces where there's neoliberal, which to me means co-optation, or like a certain kind of hyper conservatism, which can co-opt more liberal and progressive terms. Like, I think the whole anti versus decolonial thing is something we think about because it's like, let me nitpick this language and infight. But then I also think, like, does it really matter? But then sometimes I wonder, yes, it does, because ideally we're speaking towards the same goal. But then I think that's also like a sort of non-political question, as long as we're fighting towards the same kind of loose target in the beginning, and then it gets more specific later on. I guess less whether or not the difference matters. I wonder at what point in the political struggle does the difference matter? Because I don't think it matters at all points.
I don't think it matters at all points either. And I don't want to create a false binary or even a rejection of one or the other in favor of any lineage of thought, because they both draw upon each other and are embedded in each other's lineage. And my focus on like decolonial thought is a bit more of a fixation on semantics, like for real. Like, it's not an identity, and it's not something to like really get nitpicky about, like, will I work with this person because they're anti-colonial versus decolonial? Like, that's not what I'm working on. But it's like the thing with decolonial thought, and it's more about the action and in the verb of the word itself, or like the verbiage of the word itself, is that it takes that anti-colonial position beyond just the opposition of like this foreign tyranny and opposition as a labor of creating a new political canon and drawing on our past in a pre-colonial society and our connections with new technologies and new ways to preserve what we can grow from, so that we can actively fight against politics that bolster domination and build an autonomous movement for self-determination. There's like different historical facts, and I don't think it's only Western, because that's what happened in India. That's what happened in China. Or at least when you're talking about like Westerners talking about liberals, or folks that are a bit more like liberal capitalists that take control after a more progressive or communist society is happening, or after there's a revolutionary influx of thought and action, like in India, for an anti-colonial struggle. And one thing that happened was they fought against foreign domination, but kept very long-stead and pre-colonial internal dominatory factors, such as like Hindu caste systems. There's continued to be issues, and there continues to be like, they created their own settler complex throughout that, with unifying into what they had as an anti-colonial force. And I very much believe we can have these conversations while we are fighting, because we can walk and talk at the same time, because we're going to have to figure things out while we're doing things. So if people tell you, oh, we can't have these kinds of conversations while we're doing actions to preserve our own lives, those are people that want to be stuck in their reactive phases. And those are purely reactive, and they're not continuing to grow from something. And that's what I think a purely anti-colonial lens will lead to, or like at least history-wise, or like that is what's been there. And I think it's also just like a semantics things in which the decolonial term is also a bit newer in the way of indigenous studies and anti-colonial studies. And it's not something that's opposite to anti-colonialism in any sort of way. And like they grow upon each other, and it is an evolved understanding or perspective. Not evolved as in like progressed more upon. Evolved as in is a separate perspective in and of itself that says, yes, of course we will have this solidarity based on getting this colonial entity out. But we also have a set of principles by which we understand we need to get ourselves to live by and engage in ourselves with. That's the sort of like autonomous society building that I think is understood. And it's based off fighting the tyranny from the colonizer, which we can see mirrored in what they were used to exploit us with and colonize us with in the beginning. So like we can't admit that we don't have those same tendencies as societies that were colonized, but we can fight those alongside fighting the domination.
It's an interesting philosophical conversation because it's also about whether or not we really have the capacity to change. Because if you're talking about like we're anti-colonial, which is like we're against this political process, versus decolonial, which is like we're trying to remove aspects of this political process from ourselves. If you align more with the first one, which is trying to take down a political idea, it's kind of saying that the political idea is to blame. But when you say like we're decolonial, we're trying to decolonize ourselves and the spaces around us, it's saying that there's individual and structural kind of blame or complicity. I think it's like an interesting kind of thought process or discussion to think about it in terms of like maybe some people are more anti-colonial because they believe humans are harder to change, and maybe some people are more decolonial because they believe we can change, or there's that possibility. Like just like we can change the world, we can also change how we are. It's like how some people say humans are just selfish. So I mean, you take away capitalism, it'll probably be something else. And I'm like,
well, I think that's too broad. There's less our complicity, but I think there is a responsibility because we still live in these structures to still fight against all of the racism, patriarchy, and other forms of domination that are engaged and embedded in these colonial societies. And remnants of those sorts of oppressions are used to help split and create hierarchies inside of colonized societies. I think just anti-colonial is just a bit too broad, because you can be that anti-colonial liberal who just kind of wants Britain off your back so you can go west and get more slaves. That's the anti-colonial struggle, technically.
And now we'll take a break in this episode to dive deep into the history of Palestinian liberation and struggle for autonomy. In these political conversations, we at the Dugout think it's really important to break down some of the specifics through the decades about how the State of Israel was formed, the different tactics it utilized to disenfranchise and disempower Palestinian people. So settle in and get ready for a history lesson.
Palestine spans over 3,000 years, documented from ancient Egyptian tablets as Peliset. The region between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River has been home to diverse cultures, kingdoms, and empires, shaping its rich cultural tapestry. It is crucial to recognize that for most of its history, the concept of a Palestinian nation-state did not exist, and imposing modern notions on historical contexts can be misleading. The Ottoman Empire's rule over Palestine for over 400 years brought about political configurations, with the population comprising mainly Sunni Muslims, Palestinian Christians, and Jewish Palestinians. Despite flaws, the Ottoman Malay system provided a degree of autonomy to minority communities, fostering relatively stable relations between religious groups.
The late 19th century saw the emergence of the Zionist movement, culminating in the first Zionist Congress in 1897, which aimed to establish a Jewish state in Palestine. Zionism, characterized as settler colonialism, sought a homeland for Jews, disregarding the existing population. Early Zionist leaders were explicit about their colonial intentions, viewing Palestine as a territory for colonization. The Ottoman Empire defeat in World War I paved the way for British control under the League of Nations mandate, providing an opportunity for the Zionist movement to advance its goals. The Balfour Declaration in 1917 expressed British support for a Jewish national home in Palestine, setting the stage for subsequent colonization efforts in the establishment of Israel. which is really convenient for the British and all the other so-called Western states as they were pondering for generations the quote-unquote Jewish issue, because they didn't feel like they could make them feel safe or wanted to spend the money, time, or anything to make them feel safe in communities. So they decided, let's just ship them off to their own little thing. That's why you'll see something like Biden recently saying, if there is no Israel, there is no safe place for Jews. That is a direct quote. That is the kind of rhetoric that these people know is acceptable, because it is acceptable to be anti-Semitic in general spaces in a way that most people don't even know how to clock. So we might as well just put them all in another place, is essentially what is the most dominant understanding of why there is a need for a Jewish state to even exist, as is an ethno-state to even exist.
On the rise of Zionism, the geopolitical landscape of Palestine underwent significant transformations, setting the stage for the complex and contentious issue known as the Palestinian question. The decline of the Ottoman Empire, the rise of the Zionist movement, and the imposition of the British Mandate on Palestine in 1922 all contributed to a tumultuous political environment. Despite Zionist settlements predating the Mandate, British support provided the necessary impetus for the Zionist movement to intensify colonization, leading to the establishment of the Jewish Yishuv as a proto-state within the existing nation. The settler logic of elimination, characterized by the denial of Palestinians as a people and the justification for their removal, became a cornerstone of Zionist rhetoric.
Palestinians' historical role as refuge for diverse populations fleeing war and famine was overshadowed by the Zionist movement's lack of interests in coexistence. Native Palestinians initially welcomed the early Zionist settlers, working alongside them. The British Mandate exacerbated distrust between Palestinian and Zionist population, with reports attributing tensions to British favoritism towards Zionist settlers. The Mandate period witnessed resistance from the native population, culminating in the 1936 revolt.
And then in 1947, occurred the 1947 United Nations General Assembly, where a resolution was presented recommending the establishment of the Arab Palestinian and Zionist Jewish states. This 1947 resolution faced Palestinian rejection as it allocated a majority of the land to the Zionist settlers. The internal discussions within the Yishuv revealed a tactical acceptance of partition, with the ultimate goal of expanding the entire land.
Despite the rejection by Palestinians and the unenforceability of the plan, the establishment of Israel and the subsequent events laid the groundwork for the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. The demographic challenge posed by the Palestinian population led to the development of Plan D, adopted in 1948, outlining the expansion of Zionist borders and the expulsion of Palestinians resisting colonization. The Arab states reluctantly intervened, primarily focusing on territories designated for the Palestinian Arab state in the 1947 partition plan. The ethnic cleansing continued post-war, shaping the post-armistice landscape and laying the foundation for discriminatory laws that persisted in Israel today. In mid-May 1948, the State of Israel was officially established in occupied Palestinian territory, ethnically cleansing approximately 80% of Palestinians in its newly acquired territory. The following years would consolidate Zionist control, instituting discriminatory ethnocratic laws and policies that facilitated the theft of Palestinian property and anti-blackness within the region.
Post-war, Palestinians in the Nakab and near ceasefire lines faced ongoing mass expulsion into the 1950s. The absentees property law was pivotal in seizing refugees' properties, legitimizing what amounted to theft, especially as returning refugees were met with violence. The land acquisitions law allowed Israel to gain control of significant Palestinian economic assets, dropping the cost of Zionist families and kickstarting the Israeli economy. In 1956, a tripartite attack on Egypt by France, Britain, and Israel aimed to undermine President Gamal Abdel Nasser's nationalization of the Suez Canal. While militarily successful, global outcry forced the withdrawal of these forces, strengthening Nasser's regional standing. The UN Energy Force was established post-1956 to secure peace. Despite being the aggressor, Israel rejected UNEF's cooperation, laying the groundwork for future conflicts. In the 1960s, Palestinian refugees under the PLO officially established in 1964. The 1967 war, purportedly preemptive, was a continuation of Israel's expansionist agenda, exploiting opportunities to seize territories not acquired in 1948. Evidence suggests Israel intentionally provoked war, disregarding diplomatic solutions.
Post-1967, Israel controlled all of the Mandatory Palestine. The Allon Plan aimed to permanently seize West Bank territories through settlements, constituting illegal colonial enterprises. The 1973 war served as a warning to Israel, leading to the Camp David Accords with Egypt in 1978, returning Sinai for peace. However, the Syrian Golan Heights remained occupied. The new status quo set for the Palestinian Intifada and the Oslo Accords, allowing PLO leadership to return to Palestine for statehood negotiations. 20 years after the extension of Israeli colonialism to the rest of Palestine, the people of the West Bank and Gaza Strip found themselves subjected to unbearable repression. This repression was sustained through Israel's military and civil administration in the newly occupied areas, creating an environment where civil and political freedoms were non-existent. Daily life for Palestinians was marred with humiliation and violence. Even simple acts like dressing in the colors of a Palestinian flag could result in savage beatings and imprisonment, land expropriation, collective punishment, and deliberate de-development strategies aimed at shrinking Palestinian economies were rampant. Essentially, their lives were governed by a foreign military dictatorship that viewed them as inferior in every way.
Moreover, Palestinians became cheap and exploited labor in Israel, with an estimated 35 to 40% of the Palestinian workforce operating within the Green Line. This concentrated repression and exploitation created a volatile atmosphere which exploded on December 9, 1987. An Israeli Defense Force truck crashed that killed 4 Palestinian workers. 3 from the Jabalia refugee camp in the Gaza Strip served as the trigger for what became known as the Intifada. This widespread resistance included burning Israeli products, refusing to pay taxes to the civil administration, and forming popular committees to provide services and promote Palestinian self-reliance. Despite Israel's violent response, deploying tens of thousands of soldiers and employing the Iron Fist policy, the decentralized and popularly led committee proved resilient, challenging the Israeli occupation and garnering international solidarity.
The Intifada had lasting effects, rekindling Palestinian resistance and challenging Israeli control. This context provides an opportunity for the Palestinian Liberation Organization to leverage international support and initiate the Madrid Peace Conference in 1991. However, the Oslo Accords, resulting from the secret negotiations between the PLO and Israel, had a more profound impact. Despite the Oslo process leading to the establishment of the Palestinian Authority and the notion of a two-state solution, the Accords lacked concrete specifics for a resolution. Oslo II negotiations and Taba addressed more parameters. The West Bank was divided into areas A, B, and C. These areas, along with the Paris Protocol tying the Palestinian economy to Israel's, laid the foundation for the two-state solution, despite its conceptual and practical shortcomings.
And as we see it today, the death toll in Palestine is said to be upwards of 20,000 Palestinians have been killed and over 49,500 injured in Israeli attacks on Gaza since October 7. Gazans have been told to flee to the south, while in recent days, the roughly 1 million there have been repeatedly carpet bombed. Churches, hospitals, and shelters have been bombed. More than 100 Gaza heritage sites have been damaged, including the Church of St. Porphyrius, thought to be the 3rd oldest church in the entire world. Men have been kidnapped by the IDF and photographed naked, alleged to be Hamas militants by Israeli propaganda. And mainstream media depictions of Israel versus Gaza has shown many throughout the West, especially those on social media, the sort of dissonance between the humanity that it shows Zionists versus the degradation that it offers Gazans, who are immediately conflated with Hamas militants. Israel has started targeting Lebanon, which has also historically happened before, like in the 1980s when Israel colluded with Christian militant groups in Lebanon to attack Palestinian refugee camps. Countless journalists have been unalived in the region as well. Disease could be spreading. That has also been reported on the news as well. So many people have lost their lives, and in a lot of ways, what's happening in Palestine right now is kind of yet another fever pitch in late-stage capitalism and further manifestations of settler colonialism.
There's no way to deny this is a genocide. This is an attempt. This is a crime committed with the intent to destroy a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group in whole or in part. That's your boy the UN, Big Papa to your boy Israel. Like, these are the folks that no longer want to engage in a global process and just focus on creating their own little perfect home, which is completely far right and hypocritical of so many things that folks that they claim want to hold that land.
And I think another
true.
fact that I want to raise is think about any time that the white man has ever tried to bring religion to anybody. And Zionism, to me, I say the white man because I'm like, it's a supremacist ideology, so I conflate it with like white supremacy is essentially what I'm saying. When they wanted to bring religion to the indigenous people, they had to beat their asses, give them sickness and blankets, put them in boarding schools. When they had to bring religion to the Africans, it was to make us more impressionable for slavery, to put us in a kind of ideology that put us in this racial hierarchy. And when you look at what Zionism and the state of Israel is doing to Palestinians, it's using this kind of religious idea to subjugate a group of people in a region where people of different religions have existed for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so it's sort of the same socio-political and religious demand in order to take away land, to degrade a certain group of people. And it's done by a certain segment of a group of people that have survived a genocide themselves, or like their own like cleansing. And so it's this weird, horrific mixture of victimhood and aggression, which I think is also another symptom of settler colonialism, like the oppressor trying to control the media or historical narrative so it can always be in the defensive kind of standpoint, which is why Zionists are like, if we don't unalive Palestinians, if we don't take away Hamas, they're going to come and murder us. And it's kind of like, that's propaganda.
Well, let's just celebrate that Kissinger is dead, and hopefully his ideas, when he was influential in our state and international affairs, die out soon as well, and the people that support them.
So I guess the
die.
question I have in this discussion is, why is it important to understand the ways that colonialism shifts and changes forms over time, whether it be the more historical forms of colonialism that we see as literal slavery of human bodies for labor, like in plantation slavery, or it be processes of sort of socio-political colonization, so looking at post-independence struggles in various countries around the world, versus what we're seeing now in the attack on Palestinian people by the state of Israel. Why is it important to kind of understand how it changes over time, and how can it help us respond to what's happening today?
It goes back to what we were talking about earlier, with the whole nature of colonialism being about extracting capital and being about extracting more land. And the reason they want to do that, allegedly, because there's nowhere else they're safe in the world. So they have to go do genocide to not get genocided. Allegedly. That basis itself lets us know that it affects our material conditions, and therefore the conditions of how we struggle and what we have to do to achieve self-determination. That is just about what is the allocation, what is the distribution of resources, of labor, of care resources, and what can be done to expand that for folks that are trying to act in a way that we want to give our labor to and confederate with. As people with strong lineage and actively engaging in Black liberation and decolonial liberation on Turtle Island, it is known that, okay, what do we have to do is not even not engage, but the economy that is actively killing us has to get less of our labor. A lot of people say, like, a lot of the best times of my life is already anarchy, because I'm already doing things that are for me, for my friends, for my community, for the people around me, for different groups. And then how can we really tie into that and get something that affects our material conditions and build something a bit more sustainable so that we can continue to fight against entities that will just kill us, or will just kill our friends, kill our families, all for the profit motive. And there's different ways that changes and comes into interplay, because there's settler colonialism, there's internal colonialism, and there's different ways that are advantageous politically for different states. Because if you want to claim to be the only democracy in the Middle East, you want to have your one state, then they just want to have that full apartheid state. They want to have that ability to discriminate at will.
How colonialism shifts and changes forms over time is because colonialism is one of many social, political, and economic enemies that we're up against in the fight toward autonomy and liberation on like a global scale. understanding how it changes over time helps us understand the ways that the tactics of our enemies, whether that be individuals or structures, how those have changed over time. And for me, colonialism can be as simple as how I feel when I go out to the club and how I feel desired in those spaces. And it's also related to how I feel comfortable spending my money or how I don't feel comfortable spending my money. It's also related to what I think about voting or borders or nationality or even the concept of unjust detention and incarceration, because as a Black American / someone who has come from a Caribbean family, I understand what it means to be arrested by police or to be targeted by the state. And so when I look at the Palestinian struggle, I see how even though it's a different place in the world, some of the same tactics are being used, and the language is similar once you have more of an understanding of history and how colonial media essentially propagandizes to us these notions of peace versus hate. And peace is always kind of the white man's notion of war, and hate is the marginalized person's notion of freedom or liberation. And how having these lenses to look at our world through as these oppressive systems change, I think it allows us to react in more human ways and in more empathetic ways. And I think it allows us to argue the right things with other people when it's most necessary. But I think about how do you practice solidarity when you are navigating different thoughts or understandings of colonialism? How do you show solidarity online or offline? Are there examples of Palestinian and Black solidarity that we can look at historically that can kind of help us learn? To dive into some examples of Black and Palestinian solidarity, one of the first that I kind of personally learned about was Malcolm X's letter titled Zionist Logic, written around the time of his visit to Palestine and various parts of Mecca in 1964. Malcolm X penned a letter that was all about his reaction to Zionist ideology. I will read you just the first few bits of this letter to give you a sense of it. And it reads, "The Zionist armies that now occupy Palestine claim their ancient Jewish prophets predicted that in the last days of this world, their own God would raise up a Messiah who would lead them to their promised land. And they would set up their own divine government in this newly gained land, and this divine government would enable them to rule all other nations with the rod of iron. The Israeli Zionists believe their present occupation of Arab Palestine is the fulfillment of predictions made by their Jewish prophets, and they also religiously believe that Israel must fulfill its divine mission to rule over other nations with a rod of irons, which only means a different form of iron-like rule, more firmly entrenched even than that of the European colonial powers." Essentially, what Malcolm X is arguing in this piece is what?
I don't think he spit. I think that leans into the critique of the piece that I think I have. Malcolm X wasn't even really a socialist. He was like a Black capitalist. And a lot of his critique in the piece too has to do with like Zionist dollarism, as he says, because he doesn't have that anti-capitalist critique. He also claims that the capitalists that the Zionist state is engaging in needs blood to suck. And it's linked Zionists to like the whole bloodsuckers. While Black capitalists in the same piece were based on a vision of an independent nation advocating for oppressed people, allegedly just like the Jewish folks are. I mean, that is exactly what the prophet says, but there's also so much more context to that that doesn't make it as, oh, we got the Jews dominating the world. Like, it leaned into that time, but it also got a lot of sympathy and eyes towards Palestine as a struggle.
I think Malcolm X is speaking from the standpoint of economic liberation is a vehicle towards decolonial liberation, to the point of what you were saying earlier. Like, if you can change your material and economic conditions and the way that you relate to a colonial power, then you can get closer to a kind of idea of liberation. So if he's critiquing a sort of Zionist logic of economic exploitation and towards a kind of Arab Palestinian economic model of having autonomy in that area, is he not arguing towards a similar liberation to what we're thinking of? Or is it just not good enough because it's not the same language?
Malcolm X was a great orator. The way in which things were portrayed leaned into this vision in which it wasn't that the business practices were even that different when they were saying it between what settlers, Jews were doing in Zionist occupied territory in Palestine versus what he considered black people to be doing for the same reason. Because he even said in the piece that black people should learn from Jews business savviness to control capitalism so that they could have their own land. And this is something that's within Malcolm X's writings the whole time, is like this very dominatory understanding of economics and land relations that I don't think leads into a collective that can support multiple individual business, artistic, cultural endeavors. And it played into that conspiratorial rhetoric that strengthens Zionist logic of saying that our enemies are all anti-Semitic.
And here's one line in the piece in Zionist Logic. He says, they, meaning like the Zionist capitalist project, they can't stand against fair competition. Thus, they dread Garnal Abdul Nasir's call for African Arab unity under social. And so there's even the kind of this point about like how he is purporting that Zionism exists partially because they can't stand the notion of fair economic competition from other people. And so there is a sort of interesting economic analysis there, but I think to your point, it's not going deep enough for you to really get at are you saying kind of like the root of what some of these issues are? Because it's like, even if Palestinians get autonomy from Israel and Zionism, they might still themselves remanufacture some of these problematic political relations and ideologies. Is that what you're kind of saying? Like, without getting at the structure of it, we end up repeating ourselves?
In a way, I think it's also just about understanding the growth of our analysis and our solidarity. I mean, this was in, you said like what, the 60s, 70s? Yeah, 1964. And like, this was at a time when black social movements at the time were not rocking with the Palestinian cause on any right, left, whatever. There were some, but like, it wasn't really pulling through. And like, this is where it starts to tilt the edge. There's understanding and like structural analysis that did lead to things that continued. And it's not only because I think morally some of these things are better for our society or the language is better. These are things that are purposefully nitpicked by our oppressors to sow division and control us. And these forms of oppression and social domination and how we word and practice business, social regulation, and cultural understanding and engagements is something that we need to be conscious about and have an intention about.
Here's, I think, another way of entering this discussion. When you ignore certain flaws in Malcolm X's argument about like, the Jewish people know how to keep their money right, we got to keep our money right too. You could look at today and be like Kanye West, because there really is like a connection between this hyper nationalism that is devoid of any kind of critique of extreme xenophobia as well, or like encouraging xenophobia, and the way that like modern kind of conservative black men, it can be like a reductive kind of politicism where it's like, well, I'm going to concentrate on this area of politics where liberation means dominance, but it's also carrying over a patriarchal ideology as well, which, I mean, Malcolm X has been rightfully criticized for, like OTEPs today have been rightfully criticized for. So I think there is a sort of political undercurrent that we can see that has continued from what Malcolm X is kind of purporting to what some of the anti-Semitism that some people rightfully level against the black community is having, which is like, the Jews have all the banks in our community, we have to you know what I mean? There's a connection.
So I think another point of solidarity that we can show on, especially in a point where we're talking about international politics, what that means, thinking about how we engage with it as people, especially who are non-state actors and folks who have an influence in our communities. Nelson Mandela in 99. I'll play these clips right now just to give a context of what people who had fought against apartheid, that the world had recognized was an apartheid, very systemic racism and economic exploitation.
As far as Yasser Arafat is concerned, I explained to Mr. Sidney that we identify with the PLO because just like ourselves, they are fighting for the right of self-determination.
And he was saying that all the way in 1999. These are times where we are beyond questioning whether or not violence is a tool in our toolkit. It's just how much have we honed our ability to use it in a way that liberates us. And that is the question of tactics and strategy that should be at the forefront of these conversations, and not the question of whether or not violence is useful in a decolonial struggle, which is a conversation for some folks. It's understandable for some people to have that conversation, but the overall understanding now is that the on-the-ground Palestinians that are fighting for their liberation are beyond that conversation and are making moves and building coalitions based on developing their understanding of what that means to have such forces in their toolkit. Another example of Black and Palestinian solidarity is the Radio Free Dixie program that broadcasted from Cuba by civil rights activist Robert F. Williams in the early 1960s that advocated for racial equity. It called on Black Americans to rise up against what Williams saw as an inherently racist system. It featured music, political conversation, and storytelling. And that's based off of a Palestinian radio program that Egypt was using and was ran by a lot of Arab journalist students. And the broadcasting innovation was mainly done by a lot of Gaza-based journalists that were brought to the forefront, especially at the Egyptian borders where Gaza is. Such early programming conveyed news from Gaza around the region. Every home in Algiers was equipped with a radio and tuned into Radio Cairo nightly for the news. And the groundwork for that support, for that show and the archive of communication work being used to revive communities and revolutionary sentiments came from Che Guevara meeting Fatah's staff and pledging Cuban support, and Williams going to Cuba, which had become a place of solidarity and linked the Black, Cuban, and Palestinian struggles in ways that bolstered Black communication and Black artistic and revolutionary sentiments that were able to be guarded from U.S. imperial interests by being homed in a place with such a revolutionary fever. Another great point of solidarity was in April 1970 when a Black activist and member of the SWP in Harlem, Paul Boutel, was contacted by Randa Khalidi Al-Fatal of the AIO in New York. They asked him if he would be interested in traveling to the Middle East to be a part of a delegation of Black American activists and meet with Palestinians. In August of that year, Boutel and 5 other men and women ended up traveling to Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, with Al-Fatal serving as their guide. The Americans met with Palestinians in various locales, including refugee camps and guerrilla encampments. In Amman, a group attended the meetings of the Palestinian National Council, the PLO's quote-unquote parliament, which took place from the 27th to the 29th of August in 1970. While there, the group met with Arafat, and the photo of Boutel and the others shaking hands with Arafat was featuring on the front pages of Fatah, the group's newspaper. Headed by Arafat, Fatah was the largest of the Palestinian guerrilla organizations that made up the PLO. The paper also ran a quotation from one of the group who said, "It is, quote, better to die as men than die as slaves. Our revolution is exactly like the Palestinian revolution," unquote. The person continued, quote, "And it is a drop of blood, a drop of sweat, and a drop of ink that will accept nothing except the liberation of everyone," unquote. The trip deepened Batel's commitment to the Palestinian cause. Back in the United States, he formed a group called the Committee for Black Americans for Truth About the Middle East. That placed an advertisement, November 1970 issue of the New York Times titled, "An Appeal by Black Americans Against the United States Support of the Zionist Government of Israel." A total of 57 persons signed the statement.
So adding more to the topic of Black and Palestinian solidarity, one of the clearest examples that we can see in recent years is the connection between the Black Lives Matter movement and the connection between Palestinian resistance to Zionism and the Israeli state. This article by The Nation reads, "Activist organizers and students in the U.S. and Palestine deepen their connections. During the 2014 Right to Education campaign, 10 students from Palestine's Birzeit University traveled to St. Louis and Ferguson to meet with local activists and organizers. In January 2015, a coalition of journalists, artists, and organizers representing Ferguson, Black Lives Matter, Black Youth 100, and other groups organized by Dream Defenders spent 10 days in occupied Palestinian territories." And I wanted to mention this kind of point because I've seen so much news and coverage in the last 7, 8, 9 years about the connection between the prison industrial complex in the U.S. and the Israeli Defense Forces and how they're considered one of the most advanced or kind of torturous militaries in the world, and how when tear gas canisters have been used against Black Americans and protesters in the U.S., some of the same weaponry companies also provide exploited and are profited by Zionists or the Israeli government. And so what does it mean to literally look at the weaponry used against us in our different struggles against supremacy and colonialism, and to see that some of those tools are shared, and how that in itself is grounds for solidarity? Because if you can't even recognize, to your point, kind of the economic incentives behind colonialism and war, you kind of don't really understand the intentionally inhumane standpoint of your enemy, because it's like these people are literally profiting off of weaponry. They're profiting off of similar training models or ways of surveillance or detention. I think it just means that on a certain level, we have to understand that there's all marginalized people and all oppressed people.
It gets sickening the way in which it is actually so intertwined. When you think about the US-Mexican border and Gaza and West Bank, the munitions being used, those are both two places that companies specifically sell to so that they can say that they're weapons tested for war, so that when the next thing pops off, they can be like, look, we've tested this. They've been war tested. They've been battle tested, ground tested. And that's why Palestinian American journalists from the West Bank during the Ferguson protests were tweeting out different ways to avoid and deal with tear gas.
Yeah. The core concept of hypermilitarization, hyper-surveillance, and over-policing are two very common experiences between the Palestinian struggle for liberation and the Black struggle for liberation. And so when we look at the different tools and tactics used, whether it be different forms of incarceration or solitary confinement or jailing the youth or exorbitant excessive uses of force in response to very minimal instances of property damage, or whatever you call it, a kid throwing a rock at an IDF soldier can lead that kid to being in detention for weeks, if not months, if not years. And so what does it say? That both of these processes of hyper-policing are happening in different parts of the world, and how can we continue to show ways of supporting each other? And I think that's why I wanted to do this podcast episode on one level, but I also think we're seeing another moment where we have the chance to show up for each other historically to set a better precedent for whatever may happen in the future.
Yeah, and we have precedents to build on and legacies that we are already building off of before, because this is exactly the same type of over-policing that made Huey Newton and other members of the Black Panther Party vocal about this issue in a very radical, intercommunalist, socialist way, and SNCC as well, to the point where there was a SNCC offshoot bookstore and press that published these Palestinian resistance poems. It was called Drum and Spear Bookstore, and it was born out of the Black consciousness movement surging across the United States. The store officially opened shortly after the murder of Dr. King, and the bookstore was for the first time the largest in the country dedicated to literature from Africa and the diaspora. The name Drum Sphere reflected the store's defining principle. The drum was, according to Richardson, one of the co-founders, symbolized communication within the diaspora, while the spear suggested whatever else might be necessary for the liberation of the people. The bookstore eventually developed a publishing arm, and the Drum and Spear Press. The first publication in 1969 was a C.L.R. James History of Pan-African Revolt. It simply retitled James's early work that had been published as a history of the Negro Revolt. Drum and Spear Press also published an anthology of Palestinian poetry, Enemy of the Sun, Poems of Palestinian Resistance, which is now considered a classic work and widely admired in the Palestinian community. Luckily for us, we actually had our friend Hanif read some poems from Enemy of the Sun, Poems of Palestinian Resistance. Continued to operate until debt forced them to close in 1974. But as they said, quote, "We didn't run it very well as a business. It was a movement bookstore," end quote. And I think that's a lot about where our solidarity and where our current movement has been able to push boundaries of where we thought we were at our peaks, and where we can build community and movement space and holding it together. In multiple different spaces in occupied territory all around the world, colonized folks are coming together in a way that is attacking not only the nature of colonialism, but the very essence of what colonialism picks on to make sure that it can survive.
So to round out this episode, I really want to kind of just provide some space for us to unpack our thoughts and feelings about what's happened since October 7th and how it's kind of coalesced in our minds. I can say for me, it's been enraging, disheartening, inspiring, interesting. And then, like, mind you, the other element of it all, privilege-wise or just life-wise, is I was also traveling for a month. And so I was also experiencing the reality of, ha, 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 let's go to this market. Let's smoke weed in the streets of Thailand. And let's watch TikToks for 2 hours every day and read and do all this other stuff to kind of reorient myself around these histories. But basically, I think what I've come back to is my senior year in 2014 was when my friend was student senate president, and she did a political action for social media that was very pro-Palestine and ended up getting all these death threats. And our university lost all this money and donations. And I discovered what Zionism was. And it's basically interesting to be 9 years later and to see this most recent attack on Palestine and the Gaza Strip again, and to kind of understand that I'm literally living through history repeating itself. I can only imagine what Palestinians feel in terms of that, because I'm like, you're literally living through different iterations of genocide. Sort of dystopian to understand that cyclical nature, but I'm also somewhat inspired by the fact that I feel like more people than ever are talking about it, and it's becoming a serious political issue or topic of discussion in the US, which I think is really vital and important. And if we think about the list of major issues that have materialized more in the US over the last few years, whether it be anti-fascism or prison abolition or the notion of criticizing borders. Why are borders justification to lock children up? And then now this question of settler colonialism and funding warfare, once again, like post 9/11 and the war on terror. I think it's a very fucked up collision of issues, but I think it also just shows that we're at a sort of another precipice. I think as long as we aren't beaten down completely from close or far, whatever the issue is, there is always hope.
Okay, what I've been thinking about a lot recently is Israel's having its own war on terror. There's that context, and then there's the context of the past 20, 30 years. Palestine used to be in the news a lot, and then it became one of those things where it's not in the news that much. They got their own thing. They got the Palestinian Authority. Things are happening. So, like, every once in a while, every 10 years, every 2 years, every 3 years, people give a fuck. And that is irritating. That cyclical nature of, like, people care for a month now, and people aren't continuing to engage in this.
What do you think about the line between someone who is peripherally Zionist, maybe they've been indoctrinated in it, but they're not like a defender of it, versus like someone who is very pro-Zionist, believes in and supports propaganda, versus someone who is actively in the IDF? Like, I guess I had a question. How do we react to the different parts of the spectrum of being a Zionist? I guess I was thinking like a week ago, like, when do we fight someone who's arguing about being pro-Israel? Or when do we just yell at them at a protest? Like, when is the point of physical intervention if we're hypothesizing that for entertainment purposes?
But the consequences are entertaining when it's not useful. I don't care about the image of being seen as violent. I care about using my violence in a way that is impactful. Arguing with people on the street at a protest and yelling at people.
How do you know when it's impactful?
When money stops flowing. So I'll punch Lex Wessner, but I'm not punching some random on the street. You know what I mean? There's a difference in my target, because like, what money is Joe Schmo gonna pull out? Like, he might pull out a couple grand. Yeah. Cool. Bet. Thank you. But that's not really what I'm aiming to move. Like, I want to make the Israeli economy not be able to sustain its population and its army. It has to pick. It has to pick. It's going to continue to pick austerity for its most marginalized members in its society and dehumanize others.
Well, I guess you're answering my question in a way that I wasn't wanting. So, I mean, my question is more, there are different extremes of Zionism. There are the Zionists that are like passively Zionist. There are the Zionists that are like very pro-Zionist. They support propaganda. They like thrive from it in a very clear economic way. And then there's like the actual IDF soldiers. I guess I'm asking, like, when is physical, I guess, opposition to Zionism necessary on that spectrum? Then I think you answered it. The goal of your reaction to all of this is kind of, how do we shift our economic relation to like Zionism or supremacy? But I guess I'm just more asking, if this is a social presence, how do we react to the different parts of it? Think about like the videos of people at protests and then like a Zionist like spits on a kid or something and then people are arguing with them. But I'm like, that person should be on the ground. And so I guess I'm just, and I think this has been a point of fascination to me. Instead of presenting it as a question, it's just like, I look at some of these videos and I'm like, why are people arguing when they should be throwing hands? But then I'm like, if you throw hands in the mainstream media, as we've seen, can be like the violent anti-Semites are like attacking Jewish people. You know what I mean? Where I'm just like, it feels like a moment where we're trying to argue people towards a better side. I don't know. I view a lot of this as like very fascistic. So I'm like, you don't really argue with people that are supporting like a genocidal ideology or a fascistic political process. And so I guess I just wonder, where is that in all of it?
See, but the thing is, I wouldn't even argue with them. The de-escalator in me is like, you separate the parties and we keep the march going. Like, if somebody separates from our march and beats their ass, yo, that's crazy, bro. I gotta stay with the march. Hopefully it don't get too bad. Hopefully we can make sure the homie doesn't get fucked up, make sure they get away, de-escalate that situation if need be. But one thing is like, okay, when do we throw hands? Like, we shutting down a bank, or we shutting down some random shit, anything, whatever protest is happening, to actually stop money, and it's like have a campaign against any sort of industry that is engaging in the Israeli economy in a way that bolsters it and increases its ties to foreign markets that keep it alive. That sort of action, as soon as you have the motherfucker out there that's like, oh, I'm gonna stop you from doing this, you're not. The way in which you can get ahead of that narrative is to really be intentional about where your violence actually is and when your planned violence is. If you want to consider, as this is most of our society does, especially by the laws, sabotage against industries by materially stopping production flow as violence, then I'll be smart with that too. Because of the fact that there is that lay possibility of it detracting from folks who don't get the real message of what we're doing. And that's not about me deciding, oh, is violence good? Is violence bad? When is it good? When is it bad? It's like, when is it tactful? When is it strategic? Because it's not the only tool we have. It's a honed tool that we have, and we have to hone it. Like, we have to know how to use it.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's another way to... Okay, wait, I have another question. What do you say to black people that are like, the Jews are controlling our ghettos, and they're the reason we're in the ghetto, and they have all the money, and they have all the banks, and we have to get our own. What do you say to that?
Give them a couple articles. Maybe I sit down and have a little conversation with them. I'd say no. Because I've had people talk to me specifically, this has happened to me a lot around China, because there's a lot of Africans specifically, and people in the African diaspora, and African Americans that are like, China is controlling Africa. They're just like the British, which they're not, but they do have a lot of economic interest. And they're just like, now these Chinese and Mexicans are moving on to the block, and this is a historically black neighborhood, and they're like, man, we can't do this. And it's just like, no. Also, you have to understand, the Chinese government is engaging in deals with other governments, not the people. Do you feel represented by your government? I don't feel represented by my government. And kind of follow that line. What the state's doing does not have to be indicative of what the population actually feels and would understand if they had access to all this knowledge.
I gotta say this. Growing up in Cleveland, I can say the only Jewish people I met until college were all rich.
I've worked and lived in Bexley. I've met a lot of rich and poor Jewish folks. I met a lot of terrible people. I've also been in rich communities. Rich people act like rich people.
Yeah. It is weird because I guess for me, up until a certain point in my life, I only knew rich Jewish people. So then it's like, was I specifically in a neighborhood where it was like, is that social relation like fabricated out of anti-Semitism, or is it a real economic social relation when black people are like, Jewish people are rich, or it's like a myth?
So the myth comes from the fact that Christians weren't allowed to be accountants or work with money, so they let all the Jewish people do it. And then there was economic crises. So then they were like, oh, who worked with our money? Jewish people. Jewish people own all the money. They're rich. They're blah, blah, blah. They're bloodsuckers. They're stealing our children to sacrifice to their gods so that they can stay alive through this crisis. And because they're staying alive and we're not. And it's like, no. And that was like fascistic things based on working class fears.
Yeah. Damn. Oh, wow.
And that's like one of many, many roots to that sort of myth and how it evolves.
Shows up in other communities and how then it becomes like a believable thing for certain people in a certain community to think.
I mean, because it's like how people say, man, I don't want to be a white man right now. Black people got everything. Look at fucking Jay-Z. Look at Kanye West. Like, niggas got land out in fucking Wisconsin.
So I guess in other words, someone's subjective experience, even if it is in like a certain region or location shouldn't ignore like a structural historical reality. Like Jewish people have survived all sorts of economic and ethnic and religious subjugation. And that's also taken the form of them also being lied on or perpetuated in a certain way historically as like selfish or self-preserving. I don't know, because I guess it is kind of interesting how there is this just like anti-Semitism that is so easy for the Black community to believe.
It's easy for every community to believe. Like, it's such a present part. Like, especially if you were online, millennials and Gen Z specifically, like, everyone needs to take a check because there's so much language. There's so much of early meme culture that was just based off of shit that was anti-Semitic. That was just like, hold up, why was that a joke? And then you just think about it for a minute, you're like, ethnic cleansing was the punchline.
There are certain parts of how I grew up where I literally only knew rich Jewish people until college. The people I knew in college, especially, I'm like, they represented more wealth than they did a sort of solidarity-oriented awareness of like the fucked up parts of their history. Do you know what I'm saying? Where they were survivors, not peers or allies in other people's struggles around them. Last question. Should there be a two-state solution?
Should be a no-state solution.
What does that mean? In my mind, I'm like, there shouldn't be no two-state solution. Who ran up in there and acted like they were Big Papa? It shouldn't be there.
That's what I'm saying. Okay, so here's my actual international affairs opinion, which is there should be a one-state solution, or there should be one administrative governing entity, or multiple. I don't give a fuck. But it should be a federation, at least, of governing entity, because it doesn't have to be like this binary of there's two entities there is saying that this land was always just one. It was always just two. And that's the history of it is multicultural place ruled by different empires, different people finding self-determination through what they know. The possibility for new imaginations will not come through an explicitly two-state solution. That will come through possibly confederated governing system. That is what's necessary for the bioregion, necessary for the people that exist there. Because land back does not mean, and from the river to the sea does not mean we need to do some more ethnic cleansing so that we have an ethno-state. That is what sea to shining sea means. That is what Israel's official policy for having that land is. So yeah, if there is any sort of confederated entity that is governing that land, it will not be Israel, because it's not a confederation. It is a tyrannical ethno-state that is settler colonial apartheid system and enfranchising themselves on expropriated land and labor, which is something we've seen time and time again.
Yeah, I like that analysis, and I like that it zooms out in a different way, that it opens up other possibilities. To my sort of original ramblings about there shouldn't be a two-state solution. Like, Palestinians were already there, and there are plenty of shared mutualisms before. But I guess to kind of orient my thoughts differently, it's like I think about what would reparations look like for Palestinians and Gazans and people in the West Bank and people that have been displaced over generations and generations. Like, there's the Black question about abolition and reparations. I'm not saying that I'm trying to apply the same logic, but I guess I'm trying to apply, if we're kind of talking about like anti-colonial versus decolonial, what would it look like to have some kind of reparative process, if anything like that could be near possible for people that have survived an ethnic cleansing or a genocide? But what would that look like? And would that involve a two-state solution? I think maybe with that question in mind, the most honest answer I can give is I don't think I deserve to present a solution necessarily. It's important to pontificate, but I also think how I can help or be in solidarity is to act politically on an individual and a collective level where I live to open up more possibilities for Palestinians to be able to decide that for themselves. Kind of working at it from that place, I think, feels honest. It feels intentional. And it feels like something that is totally possible.
From Enemy of the Sun, this is In the 20th Century by Mahmoud Darwish. For centuries, I did not hate, but now I am forced to raise my untiring spear in the face of the dragon, to draw a sword of fire in the face of Baal, to become Elijah in the 20th century. For centuries, I did not apostate, but now I strike at the gods in my heart, the gods that sold my people in the 20th century. For centuries, I did not turn visitors away from my door. Then one morning, I opened my eyes to find my food stolen, my wife strangled, and my child's back a field of wounds. I recognized my treacherous guests. I planted mines and daggers at my door, and I swore by the traces of the knife that none of these guests shall enter my house in the 20th century. For centuries, I was only a poet in the bands of the Sufis, but now I am an erupting volcano in the 20th century.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Dugout. We had so much fun researching and talking about this very intense topic that I think deserves a lot more exploration. Music in this episode is provided by Sam Holman Smith in YouTube. And if you wish to support The Dugout financially, access show notes and a newsletter, and be informed of new episodes, find us on Substack. Anywhere that you're listening to this podcast, you can find our Substack link in the episode description or in the bio of our social media accounts. Thank you so much for listening, and stay tuned for episode 3.